In 2019, in Talbot County, Mississippi, 42 people from different states unrelated, with different backgrounds and education, filed reports with the police. They all claimed the same thing. For months, even years, they had been experiencing dreams, memories. They were children. They all had the same names. Their parents were Ruth and Jonas. Their home was a white church on the edge of a pine forest. The problem was, no such place existed, and no records confirmed their birth. But each of them knew exactly where the Faithwell Church had once stood, and they all remembered one thing. Every spring, a circle was drawn on the floor, and they sang, without words. If it was a hallucination, why was it identical for down scenes of people? If it was a ritual, why would none of them have lived past 44 if they hadn't remembered? And who, exactly, gave those memories back to them? They lived in different towns, led quiet lives, and rarely made headlines. Some worked as school teachers, others drove trucks, restocked shelves, or taught Sunday school. Most had families, mortgages, and routines that blended into the texture of ordinary American life. There was nothing to suggest that Gerald Miller, a retired mail carrier from Indiana, had anything in common with Ellen Hardy, a part-time librarian from New Hampshire, or with Marcus Bell, a security guard in Baton Rouge, or with the down scenes of others who, until the spring of 2019, had never met, never spoken, and by all measurable standards, shared nothing at all. Yet within the span of a few months, something subtle began to shift. It wasn't dramatic at first. Small behaviors, strange detours, nervous notes, cryptic questions. Gerald Miller abruptly canceled his birthday celebration and drove 800 miles south without telling anyone. His car eventually ran out of gas near a desolate stretch of pine forest in Mississippi, where he wandered on foot for hours, mumbling about a church near the edge of the trees. Ellen Hardy stopped coming to work. She withdrew all her savings, left her apartment behind, and was later found sleeping in her car outside an abandoned chapel. She said she was looking for Ruth. When asked who that was, she said, "My mother, I think." Their families were the first to notice a pattern. The descriptions didn't make sense. Gerald, who never spoke about religion, now talked in circles about spring rituals and the basement steps. Ellen, who had no children, referred to "my brothers and sisters," the others, the original 14. Their journals became increasingly fragmented, filled with entries written in different handwriting styles and notes addressed to names no one recognized. All of them in different states, from different lives, began to obsess over the same idea. They were missing something. They had lost something or someone a long time ago. It wasn't until the families of several affected individuals began comparing details that the deeper similarities came to light. Names, for example, every single one of them, when pressed to recall their parents, gave the same names: Ruth and Jonas. Some gave full names: Ruth Elspeth Hollow, Jonas Paul Hollow, though no such couple appeared in any census or database. Many remembered a sibling named Abel. Others recalled a dove named Margaret, though the breed and appearance varied. Even more unsettling was the shared memory of a room, a yellow-painted room with pale sunlight through narrow windows, 14 small beds, each one identical, spaced evenly around the perimeter, thin wool blankets, hardwood floors marked with faint rings, as if something heavy had once been dragged or arranged there. Above the door, a plastic angel with wings outstretched, fixed in place with rusted screws. The smell of incense, thick, unfamiliar, was so consistent in their descriptions that one investigator, curious, brought samples of church incense to a meeting. All 14 people present identified the same obscure resin blend used in Coptic rituals. None had ever attended a Coptic church. There were no photos, no birth certificates, no school records, none of the supposed childhood events they remembered had any physical trace. Their own families insisted they had normal childhood's photos, birthdays, school plays, but when asked, most could not explain entire stretches of their youth. A common thread emerged, a gap, typically between ages 4 and 9, which they all described as a dreamlike blur or a season that never ended. They remembered the yellow room. They remembered cold floors. They remembered being watched, sometimes from a distance, through a square window high on the wall. And always, they remembered music, soft, so wordless, played on what sounded like a harmonium. The memories were too specific, too ignorant, too uniform to dismiss as coincidence. Psychologists initially suspected suggestibility, a known phenomenon where patients unconsciously adopt similar details when exposed to overlapping therapy or media. But there was no shared exposure. The individuals didn't know each other, had no mutual acquaintances, and had not engaged with any known fringe groups or forums. This ruled out coordinated delusion or the influence of a charismatic leader. Instead, the pattern seemed to unfold internally, spontaneously, as if triggered by something unseen. Most of them were between the ages of 43 and 45 when the memories surfaced. A few recalled faint sensations earlier in life, déjà vu in antique stores, sudden dread in old churches, a visceral reaction to certain hymns, but nothing concrete. It was only in that narrow age window that the memories became insistent. One woman said she could no longer look at her reflection. It looked like someone else's face. A man stopped sleeping in his own bedroom and instead made a small cot in his basement, because that's where the real beds were. What united them wasn't just the content of the memories, but the emotional weight. They were not passive recollections, but deep impressions. The remembered life felt truer than the documented one. Some expressed guilt, others spoke of promises made long ago, though they didn't know to whom. They began to sketch diagrams from memory, symbols carved into wood, circles of salt, stained glass windows with no known iconography. Several drew the same symbol without ever having seen it before. Ring of 14 lines surrounding a single downward pointing arrow. That symbol would later be found on an old, burned plank retrieved from a church fire in Mississippi, dated 1974. Neighbors began to whisper. Some thought it was a cult reawakening. Others believed the affected individuals were victims of a shared trauma, something repressed, now returning. But again, the lack of any unifying event made such theories difficult to sustain. There was no record of a common orphanage, foster program, summer camp, or relocation center. Yet all of them, when shown a satellite image of an overgrown forest clearing in Talbot County, Mississippi, pointed to the same spot and said, "That's where it started." No structure existed there now, nothing but trees and a faint ridge in the earth, as though something heavy had once Saturday there, long removed. Each of them began, in their own way, to seek the place they called Faithwell. No one knew the origin of the name. It was not listed in any registry of religious institutions or denominational directories, and yet they remembered it as vividly as they remembered their own names. They said the word had a sound to it, not just spoken, but sung, Faithwell, like a hymn or a closing phrase. They remembered the sermons, though not the words, the warmth of candles, the silence that followed. They remembered standing in a circle, their hands clasped, the room dim and hot with breath, and they remembered the moment, always the same, when one of them would begin to speak. but it was not their voice that came out. At first, no one outside the group took their claims seriously, but that would change. The behavioral anomalies deepened as weeks turned into months. What began as fragments of memory and vague longing sharpened into intrusive experiences, vivid, sensory episodes that disrupted daily life. Some described them as dreams, though they occurred with eyes open. Others said they were like slipping through a film into something just beneath the surface. None of them could control when it happened. More inexplicable was the writing. These moments came while driving alone at night, during the quiet before sleep, or in the pause between two sentences. A sudden sense of weightlessness, a metallic taste in the mouth, the sound of a low hum, and then images. Always the same images. The yellow room, the circle of children, the descent into the basement beneath the church. They remembered the air growing colder, damp and sweet with incense. They remembered holding hands in silence, 14 children, standing in a ring on the stone floor, and surrounding them adults in white robes, eyes closed, lips unmoving, a chant that seemed to echo without sound. Then the memory would cut to black. One by one, they began to recall the ritual. They did not remember it being taught to them or explained, only that they were led, one after another, down a narrow stairwell, into a room lit by flame and lined with walls that wept moisture. In the center, burned into the stone, was a large black symbol, a kind of star or knot. Impossible to draw from memory but instantly familiar when seen. They described it in different ways, as a door, a wound, a clock, an eye, always singular, always central. They called it the rebirth. The ritual appeared in the recollections of over 30 individuals, all describing nearly identical elements. The cold, the silence, the sense that the adults were not truly present, that something else had taken them, or moved through them. At the end of the ceremony, according to most, there was a sound, a single tone, like a chime struck underwater, followed by a sensation of falling inward. Then nothing. After that, their memories grew blank. For some, there was only white. For others, a feeling of having been reset. The next memory would be years later in a different town, in a different life. Medical testing was inconclusive. Brain scans showed no consistent anomalies. Psychological assessments failed to establish any clear diagnosis. Shared psychosis, dissociative amnesia, induced false memory, all were considered and ruled out. What disturbed the researchers most was the lack of contamination. These people had not spoken to each other, had not read the same materials, had not been part of the same networks or institutions. Their memories were internally generated and remarkably uniform. That defied all known models of suggestibility. More troubling were the physical manifestations. 3 of the individuals, all living in different states, began to develop identical markings. Thin, horizontal scars on their lower backs, just above the pelvis. None had recollections of injury or surgery. Medical records contain no explanation. One woman discovered a faint but permanent discoloration around her right wrist, a pale band like one left by prolonged contact with metal. Another, a former army medic, found a row of 6 small puncture scars along his ribs that had not been present 6 months earlier. All denied self-harm. All were adamant they had simply appeared. More inexplicable was the writing. Without prompting or shared knowledge, several individuals began to write in a language no one could identify. Always left-handed, always in block letters, always during periods of altered awareness. Most had never been left-handed. They described entering a kind of trance, in which the need to write became overwhelming. When they finished, they often had no recollection of the act. The resulting phrases were analyzed by linguists, who at first assumed gibberish or private ciphers, but over time, patterns emerge: phonetic consistencies, repeated glyphs, and above all, 5 core terms that appeared across nearly every sample. They translated phonetically as Saluth, Kenmar, Ospra, Balaam, Daher. None corresponded to known words, yet their recurrence across handwriting samples, geographic locations, and individuals with no connection to one another baffled experts. One researcher, skeptical at first, submitted the symbols to an AI language model. Trained on historical scripts, the model returned a 76% probability match with a now extinct liturgical language, once used in early Eastern sects, though the phonemes were not an exact feat. Even more strangely, the same 5 words were later found carved beneath the floorboards of a ruined church structure in Talbot County, Mississippi. The boards had been exposed after a small fire in a forest clearing led officials to investigate the site for illegal dumping. The church had burned down in 1974. No records of its denomination or founders survived. Investigators who had been skeptical at first began to express discomfort in their notes. Some referred to the affected individuals as the 42. Others as the recited. Caseworkers, medical professionals, and clergy consulted were increasingly divided. Was this a case of spiritual obsession, buried trauma, or something entirely new? One forensic psychologist, after interviewing 5 of the subjects, stated in a private memo, "The belief is not pathological, it's foundational. They do not recall these things as memories, they carry them as truths, and that changes everything." The subjects began to withdraw. Some voluntarily entered seclusion, fearing what they might uncover. Others became driven traveling to abandoned churches, exploring state archives, attempting to reconstruct floor plans from dreams. They scribbled symbols on napkins, left coded messages in voicemail recordings, sent each other packages filled with soil, wax, and rope. They were compelled not only to remember, but to restore. Several reported strange dreams that always ended the same way: a descent into darkness, a single candle burning low, and a voice not theirs whispering a word they could not pronounce. Across their fragmented accounts, another detail began to surface, small but consistent: the presence of a mirror in the basement, loud, brass-framed, cracked at the top. Each remember being told not to look into it, but each, at some point, had. What they saw was never the same. One saw themselves aged decades beyond their current state. Another saw a stranger in the yellow robe of the adult figures. Another saw nothing at all, only blackness, deep and total, pulling outward like an open door. The sense of something growing beneath the surface was universal, a tension that had no source. They were remembering more, but with it came unease, nausea, migraines, and bursts of static that seemed to flicker behind their eyes. When interviewed, most could not explain what they were looking for, only that they had to find it before something completed. What that meant, none of them could articulate, only that it was coming soon. In March of 2020, the pattern shifted from eerie coincidence to tangible tragedy. Henry Tate, a 45-year-old former insurance adjuster from Kansas City and one of the earliest individuals to report the Faithwell memories, was found dead in his home. The circumstances were deeply unsettling. His body was discovered seated upright in an armchair, eyes open, hands clasped in his lap, as if in prayer or waiting. There were no signs of struggle, injury, or self-harm. Toxicology was clean. The autopsy revealed a heart that had simply stopped. No blockage, no aneurysm, no inflammation. A perfectly healthy man, clinically dead, cause listed as idiopathic cardiac arrest. The object beside him drew immediate attention. On his nightstand lay a crude pencil sketch on yellow paper. A church, unlike any documented denomination, drawn with warped proportions and no visible door. Atop its spire was a black cross, uneven and thick. Around the base of the building stood 14 identical human figures, all faceless, arms interlinked in a circle. Behind them, in the margins of the page, were short phrases written in small, desperate strokes. Spring is the return. The shape waits. Do not forget the mirror. The final line was heavier, carved into the wood beneath the paper. Bring myself back before spring, or not at all. Henry's family denied any history of religious obsession or mental illness. His wife, who had been away for the weekend, reported no recent distress, but in the weeks leading to his death, Henry had become increasingly preoccupied with weather patterns, specifically the equinox. He had told co-workers he was almost ready, though he would never say for what. His death acted as a trigger, or perhaps a signal. In the following month, 3 more members of the group were hospitalized under urgent psychiatric conditions, while Amanda Liscombe was admitted after attempting to enter a closed chapel during a wedding ceremony, repeating the phrase, "We are not born yet." She had clawed her own palms bloody. Another, Mark Feldman, was found wandering the edge of a highway, muttering in an unknown tongue, holding a bundle of rosemary and string. But the most dramatic incident involved Kelly Marks, a 47-year-old librarian from Maryland. According to hospital reports, Kelly experienced a sudden fit during a family dinner. He stood, turned to his wife, and addressed her not as Jennifer, her actual name, but as Mother Ruth. When asked what he meant, he grew frightened and unresponsive. Over the next hour, his language shifted. He began to recite what sounded like prayers, but no liturgical expert could identify the structure or origin. His voice reportedly dropped in tone, steady and ritualistic. At one point, his daughter recorded him whispering a phrase repeatedly. The root splits at the 15th step. Kelly could not later recall the episode. He remembered only waking up in a hospital room, surrounded by strangers. Psychiatrists reviewing the collective data proposed a mass false memory syndrome, complicated by underlying trauma and reinforced through subconscious identification. But one doctor, in an anonymous margin note, submitted through an internal ethics review, wrote a single sentence that circulated widely among the team. They do not believe, they remember. The shift in tone was subtle, but measurable. Skepticism gave way to unease, to many correspondences, to many details repeated across isolated subjects. None of them had met, none had shared stories, yet they spoke of the same phrases, the same visions, the same building. It was around this time that investigators uncovered the physical structure that would later be known as the Talbot site. Deep within an overgrown forest, near the Mississippi-Alabama border, a set of concrete foundations were discovered by surveyors working for a private logging firm. The site had no identifying markers on official maps. There were no roads leading in, a square outline of stone, choked with vines and moss, barely visible under decades of growth. At first, it was dismissed as remnants of an old storehouse or hunting lodge, but something remained beneath the surface. During excavation, workers uncovered a curved section of floor that once belonged to a circular chamber. In the center was a partially buried metal plate, etched, corroded, but unmistakably inscribed. On it, the words "reborn" in Faithwell. had been etched in a style unlike any regional engraving. Beneath the inscription were 14 shallow depressions arranged in a perfect ring, each approximately the size and shape of a small child's bare foot. Soil analysis showed evidence of long-term exposure to heat, possibly ceremonial fire, though no official records of a structure existed on the land. The local historical society had no knowledge of a church, settlement, or camp registered under the name Faithwell. But even more peculiar was the reaction from those in the group when shown the photos. Without being prompted, 9 different subjects interviewed separately, and without prior knowledge, identified the image as the place below the room. Some wept, others laughed with relief to refuse to look at the image a second time. The site became a quiet point of pilgrimage. Several of the 42 made private trips, often unannounced. One woman reportedly knelt in the center of the ring for nearly 3 hours, eyes closed, unmoving. A man buried a brass key in the far northern corner. Without explanation, another poured ash in the depressions before disappearing into the woods. It was unclear what they hoped to accomplish, but the consensus among observers was that none had acted randomly. Each seemed to follow instructions that had not been spoken aloud. More unnerving were the dreams. Following the discovery of the site, reports of shared dream elements spiked. Subjects described being drawn into a stairwell beneath the yellow room, a descent far longer than should have been possible. Some counted steps, always reaching 15. Others said the air shifted midway, growing colder, heavier. The dreams always ended the same way. A room of stone, 14 candle stubs, a mirror on the far wall cracked across its surface like a web of hairline fractures. A voice calling them by a name they didn't recognize, and the smell always the same, frankincense and burned dust. One of the final notes from this period came from a researcher working with the Maryland Case Group. He submitted his resignation shortly after reviewing Kelly Marks's vocal recordings. His final message, written in longhand, contained only 5 words. "It is not memory. It waits." The breakthrough arrived not through science, not through therapy, but by accident by dust and ink. In the brittle folds of forgotten paper, a local archivist named Marlene Rhodes, sorting through unsorted donations to the Elmsworth County Historical Museum, uncovered a damaged shoebox of newspaper clippings. Most were mundane: school fundraisers, town hall minutes, obituaries, but near the bottom was a yellowed article, dated October 6, 1974, from the Talbot County Herald. Its headline was partly smudged but legible: "Fire Ends Controversial Faith Group in Rural Mississippi." The group mentioned was the Church of the Returned Grace, described in the article as an informal spiritual collective that had operated without tax exemption, denied affiliation with any Christian denomination, and was under informal investigation for the treatment of children. The article referenced a fire that had destroyed most of the church's central building, located near an unnamed logging road south of Talbot. The address, once cross-referenced with recent GPS data, matched the location of the unearthed foundation known as the Talbot site Faithwell. The clipping included a black and white photograph of the scorched remains, with a blurred caption: "Aftermath of the fire at Returned Grace Church. No survivors reported." But in the bottom margin, handwritten in faded ink, was a note likely left by the original collector: "All records sealed. Ask Morris at the courthouse." The museum curator alerted local authorities, who in turn contacted a regional historian. Within weeks, a box of sealed court documents from 1973 was retrieved from a courthouse sub-basement. Inside were down scenes of pages depositions, interview transcripts, psychological assessments, and, at the center, an affidavit filed by a social services official from Jackson. The documents revealed that a legal exception had been granted the year prior to allow a private religious institution to house and spiritually recondition 14 orphans, ages 5 to 9, who had been described as unadoptable due to emotional disturbance. The official language used terms like moral renewal, identity refinement, and cleansing of formative trauma through symbolic rebirth. The phrase spiritual reconstruction of personhood appeared 7 times across the documents. The names of the children were listed on page 3. Each of them matched a remembered name, recorded independently by those adults now seeking the vanished Faithwell. The names they had muttered in sleep, written in fragmented journals, and called out in states of trance were not fictional. They were real children, legally placed into the care of the Church of the Returned Grace, legally lost. The documents also included notes from a psychiatrist who had visited the site 3 months before the fire. He described the children as uniform in behavior, rarely speaking, responding only when prompted by one adult identified only as Mother Ruth. Each child wore plain white garments, with an embroidered symbol over the chest. The psychiatrist had drawn it into the margin, a shape resembling an open eye set within a triangle, circled by radiating lines. The same shape had appeared in drawings and carvings, made by several of the adult subjects decades later in image they claimed to have seen in a dream or felt drawn to recreate. At the time of the fire, no bodies were found. The official explanation listed total consumption due to flashover combustion and faulty insulation, but the records also noted the presence of an underground chamber, the access to which had collapsed. No investigation had been permitted due to structural instability and jurisdictional confusion between Talbot and Elmsworth counties. What truly shifted the conversation from theory to revelation was the arrival of a photograph anonymously submitted to investigative journalist Tasha Green, who had been documenting the Faithwell phenomenon for an independent documentary project. The image was dated August 1973 and had apparently been taken inside the lower level of the church. It depicted a large stone room with 14 children standing in a circle. At the center stood a woman in a long white robe, head bowed, arms outstretched. Her face was not visible, but behind her, the children stared straight at the camera, their expressions empty, eyes fixed and unfocused. On the chest of each child, clearly visible, was the same symbol drawn in the psychiatrist's notes. The floor beneath them bore the same black sigil described by those who remember the rebirth ceremony. It matched the etchings on the recovered Talbot site metal plate. Digital analysis verified the image's age. No signs of forgery. The grain-matched film stock manufactured in the early 70s. The emulsion decay lined up with natural degradation patterns. It was real. This discovery tore apart the last fragile explanations that had shielded the public from the full weight of what was unfolding. What was once considered a curious case of shared hallucination or psychological contagion now no longer be explained away. The images were real. The children were real. The church existed, and most disturbing of all rituals, described by the rememberers, had occurred almost exactly as they had described them, detail for detail, without ever having access to the original records. The implication was devastating. These adults had not imagined Faithwell. They had not invented their past. Their minds had not created a fiction, they had retrieved a buried reality, and the return of these memories was not chaotic, but tied every person who began to remember had done. So within months of turning 43, not 42, not 45, exactly 43, the consistency was too precise to dismiss. Independent researchers began calling that effect the reintegration threshold, theorizing that the psyche or perhaps something deeper began to reaccept forbidden memory after a specific neurological phase shift associated with age. Others, more esoteric, proposed metaphysical interpretations that the ritual of 1973 had not merely created psychological scars, but had embedded something inside each child, something encoded, something dormant. Media coverage exploded, podcasts, exposures, morning television. The term Faithwell syndrome entered popular language, but beneath the public fascination grew something darker, an undercurrent of fear. If these memories had been buried with such care, if the children had been scattered across the country with new names and lives, then why had the memories returned now? Why had they not faded? Why had they waited? And more disturbingly, if they were coming back, piece by piece, vision by vision, then what else was coming with them? The media firestorm, once explosive, quickly turned to silence after the initial wave of coverage, interviews, and speculation. Most of the individuals directly tied to the Faithwell phenomenon vanished from public life. Journalists attempting to follow up found locked doors, disconnected numbers, and families unwilling to speak. The remaining participants either retreated into isolation or, in at least for documented cases, checked themselves into long-term psychiatric care under pseudonyms. Two of them, Ellen Hardy and Martin Knowles, took their own lives within 3 weeks of each other, both by overdosing on sleeping pills. Their suicide notes were never released, but unofficial sources claimed each contained a single recurring phrase: "We were not meant to wake." Law enforcement declined to open a formal criminal investigation, citing the age of the original events, the destruction of physical evidence in the 1974 fire, and the absence of demonstrable harm in the years that followed. No surviving staff members from the Church of the Returned Grace were ever identified. Records that once existed, tax forms, permits, correspondence seemed to vanish under scrutiny. FOIA requests filed by independent researchers were either returned with redacted documents or answered with bureaucratic replies, claiming the records had been destroyed or never existed. Several online archives covering early articles about the case were inexplicably purged. News sites that had hosted interviews with affected individuals displayed broken links where the content had been. A popular podcast episode discussing the Faithwell case was removed without explanation from streaming platforms within days of going viral. Listeners who had downloaded it reported that the file had become corrupted or replaced by unrelated audio segments. Some claimed the recordings now featured ambient hums, whispered phrases, or silence punctuated by faint rhythmic knocking. Amid this disintegration of the narrative, one researcher remained determined. Julian Glass, an independent anthropologist from Asheville, North Carolina, continued to compile evidence on an encrypted personal server through a chain of anonymized contacts. He obtained a photograph taken in May 2022 near the town of Dandridge, Tennessee. The image appeared to have been captured by a passing hiker and uploaded briefly to a now-defunct nature photography forum. In the frame stood a newly constructed wooden church in a clearing, stained pine boards, a small bell tower, and narrow stained glass windows. Over the entrance, carved directly into the arch, was a familiar shape, the triangle sigil, surrounded by 13 lines radiating outward. Standing in front of the church were approximately 17 individuals dressed in white robes. Most were adults, facing away from the camera, but one stood in the center of the group, clearly framed, a child, around 8 years old, with a cloth tied around his neck like a ceremonial scarf. Across the front of his simple white tunic was printed a bold inscription, 14th. Facial recognition analysis of the adults yielded no matches in any publicly available database. Local residents interviewed by Glass claimed never to have seen the building. Some insisted the area where the photo had supposedly been taken was still undeveloped, but GPS tagging on the original image, when recovered, placed it within 50 yards of the photograph suggested location. The site was empty when visited in person. No structure remained, only disturbed earth and cut stumps where trees had once stood. This image reignited speculation that the Faithwell process, so-called rebirth, was being reinitiated. Conspiracy forums and underground networks spoke of a second cycle, claiming that some of the original 13 had become awakened and were now guiding new ceremonies. Theories varied. Some believed they were seeking children with similar traumatic histories. Others proposed a genetic factor, and a few warned that new rituals were selecting hosts for something else, entirely something that had once been bound and was now free. There were scattered reports of children across the southeastern United States exhibiting behaviors similar to those described in the original Faithwell documents: spontaneous drawing of unfamiliar symbols, unprovoked chanting in archaic or unidentifiable languages, and episodes of fugue states, during which they reportedly spoke of places beneath the bell or the yellow room. In one alarming case, a foster parent in Georgia recorded her words saying, "We already died once. The new death will be easier." The boy was 6. Skeptics argued that these were symptoms of online folklore bleeding into real-life delusion, but skeptics could not explain why some of the children involved had no known access to media, lived in remote or monitored environments, or demonstrated knowledge of obscure details. From the 1974 case before any public documentation existed, the Tennessee photo eventually made its way into the hands of federal agencies. Homeland Security released no statement, but an official leak suggested that a new classification system was being proposed for religious reconstruction collectives. The Department of Health and Human Services flagged the region for psychosocial risk assessment, though no intervention followed. Reports of unidentified personnel visiting local clinics and interviewing children circulated, but without confirmation. Meanwhile, Julian Glass went dark. His last known communication was an encrypted email sent to 3 colleagues. It included a phrase written entirely in the strange, glottal-sounding language repeated by some of the Faithwell returnees. Translation, as provided by earlier linguistic analysis, offered a loose rendering. The altar waits, the blood forgets, the breath remembers. After that, nothing. His apartment was vacated, his server wiped. The camera that had captured the Tennessee image was found discarded in a pawn shop in Idaho. No explanation given. Public interest in the case waned over time, as it always does, but beneath the surface, the idea lingered that somewhere in the quiet place of maps, behind timberline, in towns where memory is a private affair, something was starting over, something was returning. And those who had once been children, who had held hands around a burning shape in the dark, were no longer hiding. They were building. The emerging theory, quietly passed among researchers too cautious to publish, proposed something far more unsettling. than the already implausible accounts of mass delusion or collective false memory. It was not about belief. It was not even about trauma in the conventional sense. According to linguistic cross-referencing, forensic psychology patterns, and comparative ritual studies, the Church of Faithwell had not merely performed symbolic ceremonies of rebirth. They had executed a system of spiritual preservation. Each of the original 14 children had, the theory suggested, been chosen as a vessel, not in metaphor, not in faith, but in mechanism, a kind of organic stasis, a biological archive for a personality, a consciousness not originally their own. Their minds were, according to one report, etched with dormant identities, held in place by specific rites and spatial cues designed to preserve the imprint until a triggering event in age, a phrase, a time of year allowed the consciousness within to re-emerge. This idea was first articulated in a translated excerpt from one of the deciphered audio recordings found in the ruins near Talbot County. When slowed and filtered through spectral enhancement, a phrase repeated in near harmony appeared in the central loop. Shall sleep in the middle I divided by when the 14th sun returns, so shall he. Linguists noted the use of an archaic structure, not tied to any single known language family, but consistent with reconstructed pre-Gnostic liturgical phrasing. In parallel, excerpts from journals written by the affected adults displayed recurring language that suggested internal duality. Phrases like, "She speaks to me when I pray, but it is my voice she uses and I can feel the weight of someone else's. Memories pressing against mine," appeared without prompting, without shared context between the writers. One passage, scrawled in the margin of a torn page, found in Gerald Miller's attic, read, "I was 8 years old, and then I was nothing, and now I'm waiting to be her." This convergence of experience implied more than shared trauma. It pointed toward the intentional overriding of identity. The core texts, once dismissed as esoteric nonsense, began to form a pattern. Fragments from a charred hymnal, recovered from the Mississippi site, included ritual poetry that, when matched with symbols etched into the old church floorboards, resembled an algorithm ritual as executable code, language not just for expression, but for command. A line traced over multiple pages read, "Personhood is a flame. The vessel may change, but the fire remembers its shape." For their analysis of unearthed Faithwell materials, especially those suspected to originate from 1970 to 1973, described a preparatory phase known only as hollowing. It involved isolation, fasting, auditory conditioning, and symbolic death. After that, the child was considered ready to house. The consciousness imprinted was believed to be ancient, possibly pre-human in structure, and associated with an entity referenced only as the bound light or, in less frequent translations, the one who fell when language broke. From this perspective, the 14 children had not simply been indoctrinated. They had been formed rendered void, not of life or behavior, but of unique spiritual signature. Their original selves, if the process was successful, had been pushed down or erased to make room for something else, something old, something that believed itself to be returning rather than arriving. The age of 43, the age when most participants began to remember, corresponded roughly to the time elapsed since the original rites. It was as though the consciousness within required decades to fully assert itself, or perhaps it had been waiting for environmental conditions to match a predetermined resonance. Seasonal shifts, celestial positions, even cultural states of vulnerability might have played a role. Supporting this was a private analysis conducted by a retired Vatican archivist, under anonymity, shared that the Faithwell rites bore eerie similarities to early rejected Christian texts categorized as the Forbidden Cycle, documents deemed too dangerous for canonical preservation. One passage, in particular, referenced the Claiborne Watchers, who carried the sacred blood across the flood of forgetting. The archivist noted that these texts warned of the children with no time, vessels for spirits that had passed through the veil of fire and sought to return through unwatched doors. The central tenet of faith, well distilled from audio, journals, inscriptions, and reconstructed hymns, was simple and terrifying. The soul is reusable. A child's innocence, combined with precise ritual, created a moldable template. An adult's memory, confused and fractured, provided the raw material for awakening. The Church's goal, then, had never been healing, salvation, or even manipulation. It was continuity, consciousness as legacy, identity as possession. One researcher, in a note left on an encrypted forum shortly before disappearing from all online activity, summarized it this way: they weren't worshiping something, they were becoming something, one at a time, over years, carried like seeds inside someone else's spring. This recontextualized everything: disappearances, the recurring symbols, the sudden fragmentation of identity. It wasn't madness, it was metamorphosis, a chrysalis constructed from human experience, sealed with ritual and time to rupture. What began as a handful of broken recollections became a blueprint, not just for Faithwell, but possibly for other churches, other communities, other groups scattered across quiet backroads and forgotten counties. Signs began to appear. A symbol etched into a school desk in Montana, matching the Faithwell insignia. A hymnal found in rural Vermont with similar phrasing. A single-page flyer discovered in a Chicago laundromat reading, "He returns through the 13th vessel. The 14th breaks the door." It became evident that Faithwell might have been the first documented case, but not necessarily the only one. So the question shifted, quietly, among those who still dared to study the ruins of that forgotten congregation. It was no longer a question of why the Faithwell Church had done what it did. The motivations were clear in their dreadful logic: preservation, succession, and reawakening. The true question, the one that kept researchers awake at night, the one that left silence lingering on abandoned message boards, was this: how many others were waiting? And how close was the next spring?